Welcome to Power Up, the podcast that uncovers the unique challenges women leaders face today. Join your hosts, Nat and Kristen, as we dive into the tough topics and provide actionable insights you can apply right now. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any episodes.
We still live in a world where there are an awful lot of all-male teams, and especially in senior leadership. We know that 90% of CEOs still are men, which has caused the rise of the diversity of thought argument. This idea, this pushback against the demand for increasingly diverse teams that look and act and come from very, very different experiences, cultural backgrounds, ethnicities, genders, and sort of push back on that with the idea of isn't thought enough.
Yeah, well, we happened to be at a talk and we had a question from a male ally who said, but what about diversity of thought when we were talking about all the benefits of diversity and diversity at every level? And so you could tell that was a narrative that he had heard or bought into. And we had to kind of start thinking about what is real diversity?
Can I just jump in with a very total tangent? Have you whitened your teeth or something talking about diversity? No. I'm like, your teeth are looking epic today. We have very lived experiences because of the colour of our teeth. They are looking amazing today.
Great.
And I actually thought that was such a great call out from him for a couple of reasons. One, I think these are the conversations that we actually need to have out in public, because my understanding is often these words are thrown around in private but not raised in groups. So very, very brave and really, really cool of him to raise it. But secondly, this is something we need to talk about is diversity of thought enough? And I think while we both had very strong beliefs, one of the funny things about working in this space is when someone asks you a black and white question like that, I think both of us suddenly we just assumed it for so long that we were like, we actually haven't got a really good answer to this.
Exactly. And then we were thinking for that week going, if we don't have a good answer to this and we live and breathe this stuff, all of our listeners won't know how to respond when they hear this very common argument of diversity of thought. So what we wanted to cover today is what true diversity means, and then back it up with 4 really compelling facts or I'm going to say arguments for the lack of a better word, that you could pull out in actually having a discussion about diversity of thought.
For anyone who actually doesn't know this, we tend to divide and conquer on the newsletter and podcast. So we've both independently researched this. So we've also got our newsletter on it this week as well. And one of the things that I found really interesting with these one-liners, and they are all over the place, right? Like we've had it with Black Lives Matter turning into All Lives Matter. We have these misconstrued one-liners. And this one is a really, in my opinion, problematic one, because while it's absolutely true on the surface, of course we need diversity of thought, the way it is used commonly in arguments is actually as a counter to the idea of true ethnic, cultural, gender, sexuality, diversity as the status quo is okay though, right? That is how it's used.
Well, it is tokenism in its truest form, in that it is a superficial effort to include diversity without actually including diversity. So it's a fob off, really.
I would almost say it's worse than that, because I don't think we ever talked about diversity of thought until we started talking about diversity. And this to me feels like a real pushback against diversity under the guise of caring about diversity. And I think a lot of the people who now talk about diversity of thought, I can almost guarantee they've never actively made that part of their hiring process. Like, they're not looking when they're hiring a room of white men going, but what is the diversity you bring to the table? So it's now a line that's used to effectively undermine efforts to increase diversity while being such a truism that it makes it really hard, because of course that's what we're aiming for, is diversity of thought. Like, that's literally what we're aiming for when we close the gender leadership gap, is this line. It's just that they've almost taken it on and using it to stop that.
And it's interesting, if you think of meetings that you've been in, no doubt there will be people that have different perspectives, and there is debate and disagreement. So for them, I think they genuinely believe they have people with differing opinions, therefore they're okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's part of this whole real challenge with talking about things like diversity is that it's very easy to take it as what we're saying is that all white men think and act the same. Like, I can see how easy it is to connect those dots.
Yeah.
That is not what anyone who's ever talked about gender equity or diversity thinks. I mean, maybe some people do. We don't think that at all. We think everyone is unique. We often talk about the incredible diversity of strengths every individual brings to the table. And I think this is where it's a real minefield in this area, because it's very easy for the argument to get derailed from we need more inclusivity, more diversity, into it feeling like a threat against white men and an attack on white men as you all think the same, you're all the same. And we don't think that at all. What we want is more than the bare minimum of diversity.
Yeah. So let's just start with a description of diversity, and then let's drop into some facts that we can really help people have constructive conversations about this. And diversity means having people from different backgrounds and identities. It's not just different opinions. And in order for that to happen, we have to have different lived experiences in the room, because we are shaped by our outward identities and our identities.
Absolutely. And I think one key element, we've got our internal individual values, strengths, identity experiences. But a huge part of how we're shaped is by how the world reacts to us, the experiences that we've had. So the example I remember seeing that was really stark for me was two men who grew up in very, very wealthy environments in a beautiful neighborhood, who both ended up, I think, at one of the fancy Ivy League schools. And one of them was black and one of them was white. And they both said, well, we aren't diverse. We've had the exact same experiences. We've had this incredibly privileged life. And when I heard that, I was just like, isn't that hilarious that they have both completely discounted that this young black man, his experience of going through, I imagine, those primarily white environments and being the exception to the rule will have fundamentally shaped his perspectives of the world. And to just pretend that's not true and that somehow they've had the same experience, to me, is baffling. It's almost like an optimism bias of like, of course the world is beautiful and we're all treated the same and there is no bias and no racism and no sexism, but it's just not true. Those of us who've been on the receiving ends of any isms, no, it's not true. So I think that, to me, is such a great example of why acting differently is actually a really critical part of diversity, because it does impact how people respond to you.
Yes. And it makes for stronger organizations and companies. And so the first fact of diversity and why people should care about diversity in their organizations and businesses is, number one, diversity drives better results. And that part of our elevator pitch for PowerSuit is we talk about diverse teams outperform on virtually every business metric. So just a couple of very popular, well-known reports has been that McKinsey found that businesses with gender diverse exec teams are 25% more likely to be profitable. And Credit Suisse Gender 3000 report found that companies with more women at the top perform better.
Yeah, so I feel like those arguments around, why there is such a gender gap when it comes to leadership, that often I think there's a few people who think, well, aren't men just better? Like, I think there is like an element of there is a reason why women aren't making it to those positions. This really undermines that argument, because every team that has genuinely built diversity has outperformed. So, well, maybe not every, but the vast majority do. So there is a real argument for businesses to embrace this and go beyond diversity of thought in its intended way into true diversity of thought, which comes from people who have to look and act differently.
Yeah.
The second one, better decision making. This is a big one, and we will cover this a little bit in the newsletter, some hilarious examples, and there's so many of them, of teams who've come to very, very laughingly silly decisions through lack of diversity. So the flip side is amazing. Companies with diverse teams make better decisions the vast majority of the time. The research has it at 87%. I mean, to me, it feels obvious. I think we've all been in rooms where diverse voices in decision making lead to those smarter decisions. And like Bic, I love the example of Bic, the lady pens, the Bic for women that were little pink pens that we could fit into our tiny, dainty lady hands. And I mean, if there had been women in the room who were comfortable speaking up against that, I'm pretty sure every single one of them would have come to the same conclusion that their target audience came to as soon as they launched.
Yeah. There's just no substitute for someone with completely different lived experience chiming in with, have we thought about this? And then actually on the Bic Lady Pens is our third point, is that customer representation matters. And the employees right up to the top, including the board, should reflect their customer base. Why? Because of decision making, because people who are similar and have similar lived experiences are making decisions based on that fact. And they're assuming their customers are just like them. And so that this leads us to some hilarious...
I mean, we've been there, right? We've been there even back at Hatch Days where we had to talk to we didn't have to. Our customer success team had their own relationships with money. And we had to spend a lot of time getting them to think outside of their perspective on money and recognize that, if you're a 25-year-old who's just started investing for the first time, talking to a multi-millionaire who has a giant portfolio, you are addressing this very differently with a different mindset. And it was so hard to build that empathy for the thousands of different types of people we interacted with. And that's normal, right? It is so hard to build that empathy across the board.
Well, and remember, I know on an earlier podcast, can't remember which one, but we did talk about...
The savant fails.
But I'm trying to think of what we were even chatting about. We were chatting about Uber and how it was a bunch of men around a table that were designing this incredible new taxi service. And at no point did any men around the table say, I wonder how safe they would feel in someone else's car with a completely random stranger. And it wasn't until 2018 that they thought, women are getting violated, attacked, murdered. We maybe have to do something about this. 2018 is when Uber started to introduce safety features into that app. And we can think of countless examples with medical research and how women weren't included in the initial trials. And there's massive detrimental effects on us, what a heart attack looks like, for example, what ADHD looks like, for example, because we didn't have women thinking in those rooms about, hang on a sec, who are our patients? Who are our customers?
I think I found the social media apps are a brilliant example of this. When we look at social media now, like it was inevitable that it was created like this, but when you actually look at Facebook, early Facebook, that was designed to be Kristen and I connecting and talking about what we wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
Instagram was designed so that we could then share photos. It was actually the creators on the platforms that decided and merged it and morphed it into something that was wildly different from what the founders, these brilliant white men founders that everyone looks to and goes, they changed the world. They actually didn't change much at all. It was the users of their platform that designed it. And the reason I say all that is look at the one that's turned up now, TikTok. Absolute dominance, because that is the first social media platform that took all those lessons and designed deliberately to be a platform that focused on user-generated content and building influencers. I feel like in terms of making money and growing, that was a great example of it happened by accident. But what if you deliberately designed it? Yeah, absolutely.
The way you initially did, which was, what was it, rating looks of women?
Oh, yeah. And poking.
Yeah, right. Give her a poke. That's right. I do remember that. I remember that.
So I think it's interesting how the world would look different had they actually thought about that and had those diverse groups in making those decisions early on.
Well, Fitbit is another great example. Do you know that same thing? 2018 is when Fitbit, and they're tracking health data, right? Health data. And not until 2018 did they start to go, our customers, of which probably the majority are women, have menstrual cycles, which impacts ultimately their health throughout a given month, and all of these metrics that we're measuring. So 2018, it's outrageous.
And I think, my favorite one, obviously, is the bathrooms at events and how poorly designed they are and how there's been no real thought about how to redo them in a way that works. And the reason that's important, like most of these examples you could look at and say, well, these unfairly impact women and it's a bit of a pain for them, but like, do the companies really care? They absolutely should, because that actually what we've seen over the last couple of years when we've pushed back against this idea that women aren't spenders, we do know we control 85% of global spending, is how much of an opportunity these companies have all missed. That they have created these environments that have been somewhat hostile to women, or these medical devices that have, or whatever else. And you've seen now this rise of all these crazy innovations that are focused on women that are making bank, while everyone else who's been sort of like, what? We just didn't know, is now missing out. So these are not just impacting women. This is an economic issue for businesses. And that's just women. Like when you start thinking about race and other various, well, the global majority, if you're looking at people of color, but also various other intersections, like, oh my goodness, like the opportunities missed is hilarious.
Yeah,
almost.
no. And people are only just catching on to it now. And then we hear diversity of thought, which isn't helpful. And the last one, the fourth point that you could start to kind of raise is that employee belonging is so important. We have more choice than ever in terms of where we want to work and organizations we want to work for. And organizations will always compete over the best talent. And where's the best talent going? Where they belong, where they align with their values, because we're waking up nowadays more than ever wanting to find meaning and wanting to feel valued and wanting to feel connected to our work because we spend so much time doing it and we've got choice. So if we are going into a workplace that lacks diversity and no one sees anyone that looks like them above them, you're going to lose your best people.
Or not even get them in the first place. We
Correct.
know one of the big narratives out there is, women are underconfident and we don't put our hands up for jobs. And what we found is if they see a About Us page that is all white men, they don't apply. And it's not because they lack confidence. It's because they recognize the writing's on the wall for their career there and don't bother. And I did the same. I was in Sydney last week and I wanted to sit somewhere for a drink. And the only place I could find close to my next meeting was like an old scummy sports bar. And it had 30 men and no woman in there. And I decided, my gut feeling was don't go in there. It felt inhospitable. But I was like, stuffer, I work in the space. I can just go in and they were perfectly lovely. They were all watching half-naked women play beach volleyball as per... I was like, this is a very uncomfortable place. But my point being that when you create spaces that lack diversity, you are actively excluding people. It's not passive, it's an active exclusion. And so I think it's a really important thing if you do want to keep these high performers or attract the best of the best person for the job, in quotation marks, you actually need to create an environment where A, they're visible, but B, their voices can be heard.
So I think, again, back to diversity is actually about the lived experience and that we have and how the world, I suppose, it treats us, how we navigate the world and how the world allows us to navigate it as our identities, external identities. And
can I just, give another one? Because I think this one is a little bit invisible, but it is a diversity of thought one, which is often, let's say you and I, we look the same, we look like we look very similar. But if one of us was neurodivergent, the way the world treated us would be very different. We would have had interactions. So even that side,
intersectionality, I think, is what you're getting at.
And I think, and I just wanted to particularly call out neurodivergence because I think that really does fall under the banner of diversity of thought. It's not as obvious on the surface, like you could look exactly the same.
Yes.
But that has a massive implications on how you're treated and therefore what shapes your perspective. So
yes.
I just wanted to call that out before you summarize.
Diversity drives better results, number one. So you'd think that most all-male executives and boards would care about this. Number two, better decision making. Number three, customer representation matters. And finally, employee belonging is key. Which of those is your favorite, Nat, that you want to end on? Because I've got one out of those four.
Honestly, I think it's driving better results because I think these days I have started to try and speak in the language of business and go, this argument often falls under it's a nice to have for women and it's touchy-feely and it benefits us, but I would really like to reframe the conversation to you are missing massive profit opportunities by not maximizing diversity.
But ultimately, you're probably driving yourself into, what is it? Not existentialism.
You are risking the survival of your business and the sustainability. Yeah.
Out of existence is what I meant to say.
Extinction.
Extinction.
You're risking becoming a dinosaur.
I even thought dinosaur in my head and I couldn't come up with the word. Okay, for me, it is customer representation matters. And this drives me crazy that I hear so often, because this is where we get power suitors from, is male-dominated industries, financial services and engineering. And I just think, what is wrong with sectors that are designing the buildings, the infrastructure, the bridges without having representation, yet they're designing for us. Number 2, financial services. I'm sorry, but like you said, women are controlling 85% of the global wealth. There's a huge wealth transfer. Women outlive.
I don't think we have 85% of wealth.
Sorry,
We have
85% of spending
but we
power.
are about to become more wealthy than men.
Correct. More wealthy than men. And actually, I think I did see a headline on that the other day.
It's the global wealth transfer.
And the fact that financial services sector is male dominated, they're making decisions about financial products is outrageous.
I mean, and again, if we want evidence of that, we know that somewhere between 70 and 90% of women leave their financial advisors within a year of their husband passing away.
Yeah.
That is a substantial amount of wealthy people who are leaving because they haven't been served. Like, again, it goes back to that. So I think our two are similar because it is about that lack of representation leads to actual bottom line not benefits, costs. Bottom line costs. It's reducing your bottom line, which is just like dumb business.
Dinosaurs going extinct. I've got my quote.
Oh, Kristen's quote corner.
And I like this one because it's Jesse Jackson, who's a civil rights activist. And I think this quote will speak to these all male teams. Inclusion is not a matter of political correctness. It is the key to growth.
I so agree. And when we start seeing this as a benefit to everyone, how fast we will change.
Now, anyone who is in Auckland on August 20th, you can come and meet us in person. We are doing a live podcast recording at the Generator. You can find details on Humantics. You can search up Powersuit or Power Up, or you can find our website, powersuit.com. Click on About, and down below is lists of all our events, and you'll see that one there. We'd love to meet you in person.
We would love to, and there's going to be a great group there. So if you're coming alone or bring a friend, you'll have a very friendly crowd of people wanting to say hi.
And we'll catch you next time.
Bye.